Hi, it's Catherine Franke. It's June 27th. And this week we saw Zohran Mamdani resoundingly, really, win the Democratic primary to be the mayor of the city of New York. Mamdani acknowledges that he's a member of Democratic Socialists of America, and he's getting attacked pretty resoundingly for that political membership, but also for his own politics about economic redistribution and creating New York City as a city that's affordable for all people. Almost immediately after the announcement of his victory, on Tuesday, the New York Young Republican Club posted on X something quite astonishing. They put out a call to action from the NYYRC that the radical Zohran Mamdani cannot be allowed to destroy our beloved city of New York. The Communist Control Act of 1954 lets President Trump revoke Mamdani's citizenship and promptly deport him. Shortly thereafter, President Trump called Mamdani a 100% communist lunatic. Hate that term, but he used it on Truth Social. Elise Stefanik similarly described Mamdani as a communist and that he should not be anywhere near the mayoralty of New York City. Now, there's a bunch of problems with this stuff, but the first thing I want to clarify is that Mamdani is not a communist. There is a difference between communism and socialism, and he describes himself as a democratic socialist, which is itself its own thing. But communism, just to be clear, is a political, philosophical end goal that thinks about a kind of political governance in which there's no right to private property. There's no concept of private property. The state, the collective, standing for all of the people, owns and controls the means of production, factories, businesses, property, and what we might today describe as the private economy or the private sector economy. So individual ownership of property is replaced with collective or state-owned property, businesses, factories, etc. Socialism, by contrast, especially the kind of socialism or democratic socialism embraced by the likes of Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, AOC, is really quite different. There's no sense that we have to make public the entire economy and get rid of the idea of private property. Rather, democratic socialists are interested in reforming democracy so that it is more accountable, directly representing the will of the people. So the idea of democracy plays an incredibly important role in the idea of democratic socialism. And then it seeks to correct for some of the most egregious forms of late capitalism that have allowed for this enormous wealth gap in this country, where the 1% has so much and the 90% or 99% has so little. So there's an effort to get money out of elections. There's an effort to see, to attack the ways in which businesses operate in ways that exploit labor in dangerous and discriminatory ways. And if you look at the mission articulated on DSA's website, they say that what they're committed to is to achieve equitable distribution of resources, meaningful work, a healthy environment, sustainable growth, gender and racial equality, and non-oppressive relationships. So they don't, again, seek to replace capitalism with a state-run economy, which is what communism is committed to. They want, as they say, ordinary people to have a real voice in our workplaces, our neighborhoods, and our society, largely through unions and a better functioning democratic political system. So, first of all, Mamdani is not a communist. He's a democratic socialist. There's lots of democratic socialists in Europe that are not communists. It's a very common concept there, but socialism has such a negative connotation in the US, mostly when it's conflated with communism, which it is not. So, but to go back to the Communist Control Act of 1954, it does not give the power to the president to revoke Mamdani's citizenship and deport him. Our immigration laws contain 3 provisions that allow for the revocation of citizenship for people who were not born in the United States but were naturalized legally, like Mamdani was. And those circumstances are if the person obtained their citizenship through fraud or deliberate misrepresentation, such as hiding their criminal activity or other kinds of histories that would have disqualified them from naturalization. Not true in the case of Mamdani. Second, if the person was associated with a group promoting violent overthrow of the U.S. government within 5 years of their naturalization. Also not true in the case of Mamdani. Or thirdly, if the person commits serious crimes like terrorism or war crimes before becoming a citizen and failed to disclose those crimes during the naturalization process. Also not something that Mamdani has done. So he can't have his citizenship revoked and then deported under immigration law or under the Communist Control Act of 1954. But I will say we should be paying attention to the Communist Control Act of 1954, not for the reasons that the New York Young Republican Club wants us to, but because it was never repealed. And it was one of the primary instruments of the implementation of the McCarthy anti-communist regime and purges of the 1950s. One of the things that it and earlier law created was something called the Subversive Activities Control Board, which was this sort of nefarious body that could investigate whether a group or a set of individuals were communist or infiltrated by subversive organizations or elements. They could require them to be listed then with the government, disclose all their members and their donors. And this is what mobilized the communist purges, the McCarthy hearings, etc., in the 1950s. Now that Subversive Activities Control Board was abolished by Congress in 1972, but there are a lot of other elements of that infrastructure of persecution, control, and shaming people during the 1950s because of their communist affiliation that could be reawakened in this time. Many of those instruments have not been repealed, and it also provides a good model to the likes of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump of how they might start going after groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, whether they're communists or not, which they're not, and other organizations that they disfavor, immigrants' rights organizations, groups that support Palestinians, etc. So it's time for us to start paying attention to this Communist Control Act of 1954 and the kind of climate of persecution and government spying and surveillance and regulation that it modeled. But the New York Young Republicans are wrong about Zohran Mamdani. He is not a communist, and he can't be deported or have his citizenship revoked by virtue of being a democratic socialist.